Fence Show here, and tonight's guest, I'm really excited to have him tonight. It's great to have you, sir. And our guest tonight is Professor Bart D. Ehrman, and we're going to be discussing his new book and also the historicity of Jesus and the New Testament canon, hopefully. And his new book is How Jesus Became God: The Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. Sir, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome, sir. And Paul, I think we have a little bio on Bart Ehrman here. Please have at it.
Yes, definitely. Bart D. Ehrman is a James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He came to UNC in 1988 after 4 years teaching at Rutgers University. At UNC, he has served as both the Director of Graduate Studies and the Chair of the Department of Religious Studies. Professor Ehrman is a graduate of Wheaton College in Illinois and received both his Master's of Divinity and PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, where his 1985 doctoral dissertation was awarded magna cum laude. Since then, he has published extensively in the fields of the New Testament and early Christianity, having written or edited 24 books, numerous scholarly articles, and dozens of book reviews. Among his most recent books are a Greek-English edition of the Apostolic Fathers for Loeb Classical Library, an assessment of the newly discovered Gospel of Judas, 4 New Times bestsellers, Jesus Interrupted, God's Problem, Misquoting Jesus, and Forged. His books have been translated into 27 languages. Among his fields of scholarly expertise are the historical Jesus, the early Christian Apocrypha. I always screw up that word. I apologize.
Apocrypha, it's okay.
Thank you. And Paulistic Fathers, and the manuscript tradition of the New Testament.
Awesome. Let's get on with the Q&A here. Here we go. I'm going to play a quick clip here, Bart, and I want your reaction to it before we get on. I'd like to open up with a little joke here, so let's listen to this clip real quick here. Here we go.
That is to say, you assess competing historical hypotheses in terms of criteria like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, degree of ad hocness, concordance with accepted beliefs, and so on and so forth. And I'm prepared to argue that when you put the resurrection hypothesis next to naturalistic alternatives, you will be able to show on balance that the resurrection hypothesis comes out far outstripping its rival naturalistic theories, unless you presuppose some sort of methodological atheism to bar this. And I think that's what Dr. Ehrman does. In the same way I'm a believer, and therefore find God's existence quite plausible, as an unbeliever, I think he finds this just absurdly improbable. But he's not given us any reason to think either that God's existence is improbable or that it's improbable that God raised Jesus from the dead. In fact, he can't give an assessment of that probability given his claim about the limits on the historian.
I'm sorry, I have trouble believing that we're having a serious conversation about the statistical probability of the resurrection or the statistical probability of the existence of God. I think in any university setting in the country, if we were in front of a group of academics, we would be howled off the stage.
It's not true.
Well, it may not be true at the school you teach at, but at the
So what I want to ask you is, what was going through your head when he was saying all that, like statistical probability on the Jesus resurrection and so on? It's like, come on, it's like, really?
Yeah, no, he mounted a mathematical proof that showed that Jesus must have been raised from the dead.
It is pretty entertaining, though.
That is very entertaining. How glad are you that William Lane Craig was not your math teacher?
Oh, that's great. All right, let's get a little serious here. I like to open up with a joke here and there. All right, well, before we start, I want people to get to know who Bart Ehrman is. You know, the history of Bart Ehrman. I understand, at least I should say that. Give us a little history on how you went from being a born-again Christian, a fundamentalist born-again Christian, to an agnostic. What was the journey like? What questions did you ponder? Your convictions, etc. So let people get to know who you are.
Yeah, so it was a long journey. I had a born-again Christian experience when I was in high school. And after high school, I went to Moody Bible Institute, which is a fundamentalist Bible college. And I was completely convinced that the Bible was the infallible, inerrant Word of God with no mistakes of any kind whatsoever. after Moody, I went to Wheaton College, and I learned Greek there, and I started reading the New Testament in the original Greek. And after that, I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, where I learned Hebrew. So I was reading the Old Testament in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek, and I started finding that there are, in fact, mistakes in the New Testament and the Old Testament. Once you start finding them, you start seeing them everywhere. And so I moved away from being an evangelical Christian, but I was a liberal Christian for years and years. Eventually, what ended up leading me to become an agnostic was unrelated to my scholarship. It was the problem of suffering in the world, and how you can explain why there's so much pain and misery if there's a God who's in control, who is answering prayer and intervening to help people. You know, if that's true, then why is it that a child starves to death every 5 seconds?
Isn't that very common in deconversions?
I think the problem of suffering is a very common reason for people deconverting, because it's, you know, the problems of the Bible. I mean, if you've got problems with the Bible, you can just become the kind of Christian that doesn't think the Bible is infallible. But the problem of suffering calls into question whether there's any divine being who's looking out for this world or not. So I think it's a pretty common path that I took.
Next question I want to ask is, give us a little overview of your latest book, how Jesus became God. What questions did you ask yourself, and what did your research entail in the creation of your latest book?
Right. So this book took a long time for me to write. I worked on it for about 8 years, and the question that drives the book is, if Jesus was who we think he was, who historians say he was, that he was a Jewish preacher, lower class peasant from rural Galilee, who offended the ruling authorities and got crucified for his efforts, how do we get from that to Jesus being the Lord God who created the universe? You know, how do you get from point A to point B? And you know, we certainly did get from point A to point B, and I treat this as a historical question. I actually treat it in a way that I mean to be open to whether a person's a believer or not, because even if somebody's a Christian, they've got to figure out how this happened, because Jesus wasn't going around saying that he was the second member of the Trinity during his ministry, but Christians ended up saying he was the second member of the Trinity. So my book tries to deal with the question of how that all happened.
So let me expand on that a little bit. What you just said, the Trinity. Let's give us a history on the Trinity, because a lot of people say that Christianity, early Christians, it was polytheistic, and it was later, centuries later, where they compiled them all together to say, well, it's monotheistic because God is one of all these, right? So you want to break that down a little bit?
Yeah, so it's really a central part of my book, because the early Christians, right after Jesus' death, I argue in the book that as soon as some of his followers came to think that he had been raised from the dead, they started calling him God. So this wasn't happening 300 years later. This was happening, like 30 days later or something. It was like, or 3 months later. It happened really fast that they're calling him God. But as soon as you call Jesus God, you've got all sorts of problems. Because if he's God, well, in what sense is he God? Is he God like equal to God, or is he a lower level divinity, or how do you understand that? Eventually, the Christians came to say that Christ was fully equal with God, but that then created the problem that led to the Trinity, because if God the Father is God and Christ is God who's equal with God the Father, then don't you have two gods? Mm-hmm. And if you throw in the Holy Spirit, you got three gods. Mm-hmm. But the Christians wanted to insist that they were monotheists, that there's only one God. And so the philosophers among them, the heavy-hitting theologians, worked out a way of figuring this out, which is the doctrine of the Trinity, which is that there are three persons, they're all distinct from one another, they're all completely God, but there's only one God. So that's the doctrine of the Trinity.
That's great, and I want to expand further on that before I get to my other questions, is because I'm coming off these questions off the cuff here as you're talking, is what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is when you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I think it's John that only recognizes the divinity of Christ and the other three don't. Could you expand on that?
Right. So this is something I've changed my mind about while doing the research for my book. I used to think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Luke understood Jesus to be human but not God, and that the Gospel of John understood Jesus to be God. And the reason for that is because in the Gospel of John, Jesus makes all of these amazing claims about himself. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, speaking about the father of the Jews, Abraham, who lived 1,800 years before Jesus, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." That word, those two words, I am, are actually the name of God in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus. When Moses asked God what his name is, God said, "My name is I am." And so Jesus is claiming the name of God. And later in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, before Abraham was, later in the Gospel of John, he says, I and the Father are one. And later he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So he has these enormous claims for himself in the Gospel of John that you don't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so for years and years, I thought Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't portray Jesus as God, but I actually changed my mind about that. I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke do think that Jesus is God, but they don't think that he's God in the same sense that John thinks that he's God. In Matthew, Mark, and in Mark's Gospel, for example, the reason Jesus is God is because he was a human being who was adopted by God to be his son. So he was the adopted son of God, a man who was exalted to the level of divinity. Whereas in the Gospel of John, Jesus started out as God. I mean, he was God in eternity past, and he became a human being. So they both see Jesus as God, but they see him as God in a different sense.
Great, thank you. And anybody, if you want to know more about this, please go check out and purchase and support Professor Bart D. Ehrman here. His new book is How Jesus Became God, the Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee, and that's what we're talking about a little bit here, the historicity of Jesus, and maybe we're going to be touching on New Testament canon, which we have been, I should say. My next question for you is this, and I got a couple viewer questions that they just hit me up with earlier today. My next question is, if I can find it real quick here, is I know you've been getting a little heat on this issue, this question here, so I'll ask it here, of course. Do you think Jesus saw himself or proclaimed himself to be God? Historian's point of view, of course, you're going to go with a theological point of view. Please expand and enlighten us and the viewers here.
Right, so I devoted an entire chapter to just this question in my book, and what I do is I try to explain what historians can say about the historical Jesus. One thing we can say is that he did not go around talking about himself the whole time, that in fact he talked about there being a kingdom of God that was going to come to this world. Jesus, like many other Jews of his time, thought that the world that he was living in was controlled by forces of evil, and that these evil demonic powers were in control, but God was soon going to intervene to overthrow the forces of evil and set up a good kingdom on earth. And this is going to happen soon. That is going to happen within his disciples' lifetime, that this utopian perfect kingdom would arrive and there'd be no more pain or misery or suffering. So if that's what Jesus basically was proclaiming, what did he proclaim about himself? Well, I'm not sure he went around proclaiming much about himself, but he certainly thought that he was a prophet of God. He thought that, he had God, he understood what God's plan was for the future. So he was a prophet. And I argue in the book that Jesus also understood that he himself would be the king in this future kingdom. That when God brought in a kingdom, he would make Jesus the king. That's why when the Romans found out that Jesus was calling himself the King of the Jews, that's why they crucified him, because it was a political charge. He was calling himself the king when only the Romans could appoint a king. And so Jesus thought of himself as a prophet, possibly as the King of the Jews, but he didn't go around calling himself God. He doesn't do that until you get to the Gospel of John, which is written about 50 or 60 years later. So in the earlier Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus doesn't call himself God. And my view is that if Jesus really was going around calling himself God, the earlier Gospels would have said something about it.
Yeah.
Be a rather important point not to mention. So
no, exactly, and I think that leads up to my next question here, which is great. And I'm not aware of this. Like we could look at Josephus and all that, but And I want to go original documents here. Historically, do we know of anyone outside the Bible that has ever written about or mentioned Jesus before the first Gospel of Mark was written? Okay, is there any evidence for it? Let's say original texts or books. Is there any originals, or do we have just copies of copies of copies?
Well, we don't have any author that
Okay.
mentions Jesus before the writings of Paul. Paul was writing about 20 years after Jesus' death. And we don't have Paul's original writings, just like we don't have the writings of Mark or any of the books of the New Testament. But that's not unusual. We don't have the original writings of any author from the first century or the second century or the third century. So not having the originals is not unusual. That's just the way it is when you're dealing with books from the ancient world.
Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they're according to them, right? We don't know if these are real people. These are just anonymous writings, correct, that we have? And then how about Paul?
I think we can say they were real people.
Okay. Were they written by them? That's the question I want to ask, really.
Somebody actually did write those books.
You are right. You are right. But were they anonymous? That was the question. That was really my question, not if they were anonymous.
Right, so, well, we call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But,
yeah.
The tradition is that Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, the tax collector, and that John was a disciple of Jesus, the beloved disciple of the Gospel of John. Mark was supposed to be a friend, a companion of the Apostle Peter, and Luke was supposed to be a companion of the Apostle Paul. But scholars today don't think that those descriptions are right. Those descriptions don't appear until about 100 years after the Gospels themselves were written. So originally these Gospels were circulating anonymously, and only later, when Christians wanted to assign greater authority to them, they started to assign them to apostles and to companions of the apostles.
Excellent. That's great information there. Thank you very much. I'm going to go with one more question here and a couple viewer submission questions, and then we'll get on to, I believe that we'll go with Drew, TJ, and then Paul here. Questions. I guess I have 3 more questions here, but I'll just go with one more. And this is a question I've thought about too myself. Why did Jesus become, I guess, the figure that he became? You know, especially in current day society. Why is he so important? How did he become so important? And why not the other hundreds of known ancient prophets? Let's say examples: Honi the Circle Maker, or Hanina Bendoza. I'm like, how'd that evolve?
Well, in some respects, that's what my book is all about. You know, why Jesus? And the short answer is because Honi the Circle Drawer and Hanina Bendoza and all the other prophets, nobody said they got raised from the dead. And Jesus' disciples came to think that he was raised from the dead. So one of the things I do in my book is try to explain why it is they thought that. I myself I obviously don't believe he was raised from the dead, but I leave that question aside, the theological question, whether he was really raised from the dead, and I just deal with it on a historical level. Why did people start thinking this? But whatever their reason was, they certainly did start thinking that, and that changed everything. Because if these people who came to think that Jesus was raised from the dead, they, like Jesus, thought that at the end of this age, when God intervenes to destroy the forces of evil, everybody's going to be raised from the dead. There's going to be a resurrection at the end of time. And so when they came to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, they thought that the end time had started. And more than that, they knew that he wasn't still around. And so, he'd been raised from the dead allegedly, but, it wasn't like he showed up and started doing some more miracles or started having controversies with Pharisees again. So they ended up thinking that he had been taken up into heaven. That's why he's not here. He's been raised, but he's not here. And in the ancient world, if somebody's taken up into heaven, that makes them a god. And so that was the beginning then of the idea that Jesus was God, and that's what made him different from all the other people.
Excellent, excellent. And was that commonplace back then, resurrections and stuff like that, or no?
No, not at all.
Not at all? Okay. I know a lot of people make that claim, like resurrection. Oh, that happened. That was common practice back there, commonplace.
No, what happened sometimes is that somebody would be somebody would be taken up into heaven without dying. That happened among both pagans and Jews. But the idea of somebody dying and then coming back from the dead, that was not a common occurrence. In fact, I don't know of any real analogy to it, even though people say there are all sorts of analogies, but there's none that I've ever heard of.
Awesome. One more question here that I have, and then I'm going to let these guys go, and then I'll get to the viewer submissions. Here is there a dangerous way, and this is probably a personal view or opinion that I'm asking here of you, is there a dangerous way to look at the world through the Bible that may harm society or societies? Let's say examples, people that are anti-homosexual, anti-abortion, someone that believes that women are inferior creation or an inferior in creation, and so on.
Absolutely. I mean, the Bible's been used to do a world of good, and it's been used to do a world of harm. I mean, slavery was justified on biblical grounds. Racism is justified on biblical grounds. Oppression of women is justified on biblical grounds. All sorts of wars have been justified on biblical grounds. I mean, absolutely. So, you know, the Bible. I don't think the problem, though, is the Bible. I think the problem is people. I mean, people are going to do nasty things, and they'll use whatever resources they have in order to
try to justify it. Yeah.
And the Bible's something they can use to justify them.
Absolutely.
So one more question. I'll let Drew go here real quick, and yeah, I keep on saying one last question because these are coming off the top of my head. And this is a very important question. I think one of these guys, I don't know. Is there any contradictions in the Bible? Give us an example or two. Because I hear this all the time by Christians and theists, and then we've debating them. It's like there's no goddamn contradiction in the Bible. So come on, Mr. Bart Ehrman here. Come on, is there?
Yeah. Okay. So like you have like 10 hours. I mean, I could.
Just give us a couple examples. That's fine.
All right. I'll give you one example. Since this,
I was going to say, in fact, we do have 10 hours.
No,
now you're booked.
Okay. So I'll give you one example that I often use with my students. Since this is the Easter season, the Gospels all agree that Jesus was killed sometime around the Jewish Passover feast. The Gospel of Mark explicitly tells you when it was. Jesus has a Passover meal with his disciples, and he's arrested afterwards, and he dies then the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. Mark says that explicitly, Mark 14:12 and Mark 15:25. The Gospel of John also says Jesus died sometime around the Passover, but according to John, Jesus died on the day of preparation for the Passover. That was the day when they were preparing the meal. So Jesus dies in John's Gospel a day before the Passover meal was eaten, and in Mark's Gospel, he dies the day after the Passover meal was eaten. I mean, you know, he didn't die twice, and so either both of those are wrong or one of them's wrong, but they both can't be right.
Exactly, and that's a good one because I know about that one. So I'm going to hand it over. We'll do this viewer submission questions after these guys are done because I think these guys got a couple questions, a few questions each. So I'm going to pass it over to Drew. Drew, what do you have for Bart here?
Yes, sir, Mr. Ehrman. Great to have you here.
Great, thanks.
I took a world religions class in college, and some of the more interesting things that I learned were about the early church, the early days of the church. And I was hoping you could expand on some of the early Christian sects and how certain factions won the dogma wars in the early days.
Yeah, so this ties into my book a bit because I talk about how different Christian groups had different understandings of who Jesus was. There were Christian sects that thought that Jesus was just a human being and was not God at all. There were others that said that he was God, but he was not a human. There were others that said that Jesus Christ was two things, that you have the man Jesus and you have the divine Christ, and they're temporarily unified during his ministry and then separated when he dies. And then there's a group that said that Christ is both human and divine, but he's one person, not two persons. So you have these debates going on in early Christianity over who Christ is, and you have debates about all sorts of issues in Christianity. Just about every Christian doctrine is being debated with different groups holding to different views. One of these groups ended up winning out and getting more converts than the others, and the group that won out declared that it was orthodox, meaning it had the right belief, and everyone else was a heretic. Then once they won, they ended up rewriting the history of the engagement to look like they'd always been in the majority, but they probably weren't.
Oh, very good. Yeah, if I can go ahead with another one here right off the bat.
Sure,
You kind of touched on this with Joe, but I understand that when it comes to the Gospels, particularly just the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, we don't have the originals or even copies of the originals. But along those lines, what do we have to go off of?
Yeah, well, we have later copies of copies of copies in most cases. The we have a few scraps from the 2nd century. So the Gospels were written in the 1st century, and we have one. The earliest scrap we have is the size of a credit card. That's just a fragment that was found in a trash heap in Egypt.
P52.
And it's probably about 30 or 40 years after the Gospel of John was written. We don't start getting fairly complete copies until around the year 200, and we don't get any fully complete copy until the middle of the 4th century. So that's the problem, is that we don't have the originals, and we don't have copies of the originals or copies of the copies. Well, we have much later copies, and they've all got differences in them. And so there are places where we're not sure exactly what the authors originally wrote. But I should stress that doesn't put the New Testament in some kind of unusual situation. That's the typical situation for books from the ancient world. It's just we don't have originals, and what we have are later copies.
And the one you're talking about, the credit card size is P52, correct?
That's right.
Man, I'm a biblical scholar now, man. I'm loving it. I'm an academic. Here we go.
Very nice. Very
An
nice.
honorary PhD.
Yeah, you're gonna get it in the mail next week, buddy.
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to
Liberty
it. Sorry, Joe.
University.
Go ahead, Joe. I'm sorry.
Very nice. Yeah, I only have one more that I'm going to pass you along to the other dudes, and it is in regards to the William Lane Craig debate that you had. I just had to touch on that a little bit. In your debate with William Lane Craig on the issue of the historicity of the resurrection of Christ, Dr. Craig makes the point that the best explanation of the resurrection is the burial, the empty tomb, Christ's supposed post-mortem appearances, and his disciples' willingness to be martyrs for the cause. He says that those are the best evidence for those is the fact that the resurrection actually occurred. And I was wondering if doesn't applying a little bit of David Hume's logic make that much more simpler? And by David Hume's logic, I mean, which is more likely that the whole natural order is suspended, or that a Jewish minx should tell a lie?
Yeah, right, exactly. William Lane Craig is not a big fan of David Hume, but the other problem with that whole line of argument is we actually don't know how the disciples died. We only have later legends, so we don't have any. Christians say all the time that all of the apostles were martyred for their faith, but whenever somebody says that, sometimes just ask them what their evidence of that is. In fact, all we have are later legends. And one of the things I argue in this book, How Jesus Became God, is that the empty tomb tradition probably is not historical either. I argue that Jesus probably was not given a decent burial because Roman practices of crucifixion normally didn't allow people to be buried. So the idea that Jesus was given a decent burial and then the tomb was found later is probably not historical. So that knocks 2 out of his 3 props off right at the outset.
Well,
I think the reason people came to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead is because they had visions of him afterwards, so that was the only reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's one of the ones that I hear the most is, people in Jerusalem can take you to the tomb where Jesus was buried. Those deals. Yeah, I hear that all the time.
Yeah. Well, actually, there are 2 sites in Jerusalem that are thought to be the tomb, and neither one of them is probably the site.
Really, right?
Well,
yeah.
But normally the one that I bring up is the fact that a Muslim could take me to the cave where Muhammad was given the Quran by the Archangel Gabriel.
Yeah,
that's usually what I bring up. But yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to pass you on to TJ over here.
Yep, TJ.
Why, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you on, and I'm excited to ask you a few questions. I'm sure you don't know who I am, so I'm going to let you know. Like, I'm the one that's known for giving, asking the hard questions. All right, So what's going on here is I'm going to start you off with an easy one to get you warmed up, all right? So this is just an easy question, all right?
I'm trembling in my boots.
Does the lowest common denominator of the walking on water plus the square root of the resurrection multiplied by fishes and loaves divided by the Holy Trinity equal Jesus cubed?
Yes. Well, you You need to email our friend for that one.
I just figured he thought he was going to explain a very simple mathematical equation to you. I figured maybe you could just I'm just curious because that I'm actually pretty convinced that that's the correct equation to the answer of life right there.
Okay.
Right.
All right. I'm sorry. I'll get on to some harder questions here. How does it feel? This is, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes. How does it feel to have learned so many languages that are so seldomly used and that you can pretty much never speak to someone else in that language?
Yeah, I know all these dead languages, and the thing is, even when I learn modern languages, I learn them as if they're dead languages. So that I taught myself Italian last summer, and I didn't learn to speak Italian so I could go to Italy. I just learned to read it. It's like learning how to read ancient Greek or something. So I can read Italian and can't speak a word of it. So yeah, that's probably not the best way to do things, but that's how I do it.
So how many languages are you up to now that you can read, interpret?
Oh God, I don't know. I mean, Greek is my main research language, and I read Latin and Hebrew. At one point, I read Coptic. I don't read Coptic much anymore. At one point, I learned Syriac, which I don't do at all anymore. And I read French and German and Italian.
Jesus. And Jesus, is it an appropriate
a time for tomorrow for Easter? Yeah, we're on Easter weekend,
it really does blow my mind that you've put that much effort into actually, finding out the original, in order to read the original manuscripts and whatever that you take, the historical documents, to be able to read them in their original form. That really does impress me. That's when you can tell someone's actually serious about the research that they do.
Yeah, well, it is my job.
It is his job.
And as as it's your job, how frustrating is it to constantly explain simple things like what evidence and historical sources are to over and over to different people for a living? How frustrating is that?
I actually don't find it frustrating, because people are just astoundingly ignorant, and it's not that they're dumb.
You think?
Oh, I love you already.
It's not that people are necessarily dumb. It's just that they haven't been introduced to what they ought to know, and so I actually enjoy trying to teach people what they ought to know.
And see, I can really appreciate that, but I guess I'm just one of those people where I just get frustrated.
Yeah.
After a certain amount, I'm patient to a point, and then there's that. Very quickly, the straw comes that breaks my back, and I kind of lose my patience.
I would find it frustrating if I had to keep explaining the same thing over and over to the same person. If somebody doesn't get it, then I find that very frustrating.
Like Cy Ten Brudencape.
Yeah.
If you know who he is.
Right. But if I'm talking to different people the whole time and trying to get them to see what scholars are saying, then that's all right.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Very, very well said. Let's see. In terms of modern politics, would you consider, or would people in general consider Jesus to have been a liberal?
I don't think that the modern categories can be transplanted back into the first century.
Well, okay. If we had to choose conservative or liberal or libertarian or one of these tags that we have in modern times, which one would fit Jesus most?
Well, this was the funny thing. I'm sure that all of you are big fans of Bill O'Reilly.
Oh yeah, I love Papa Bear.
Wait, Bart here, touche. He got us. All right, good.
Wait, he did, and it's Fox News that taught me that Jesus and Santa Claus were both white.
Yeah, right. Bill O'Reilly's book on killing Jesus has been on the New York Times bestseller list for, I don't know, half a year or something. And the whole point of the book is that what Jesus was really opposed to was the Roman government interfering with what was going on in Israel, and that these poor Jews had to pay such high taxes to the Romans. So basically, Jesus was a Tea Partier.
Oh my God! Wow.
He really spins
That's
it like
great.
that? I can't believe.
Wow.
Actually, I can believe that from him.
That came right out of the no spin zone.
Yep.
It's absolutely ridiculous.
That was great.
All right.
Thanks, TJ.
Let's see. I've got one more question, then I'll pass you on. I pass you on like a whore that Jesus would have defended.
Right.
How many contradictions in a holy text does a person need to ignore in order for you to start ignoring their arguments, altogether?
He's our comedian here, Bart, by the way. So
Yes,
I'm pretty sure you got that.
Yes. So, well, that's the thing. It's frustrating because the thing is, people can explain away anything if they put their mind to it. So, if what you genuinely think is that the Bible cannot have contradictions, then when you read the Bible, you won't find any contradictions. I mean, it's quite a very simple formula. If there are no contradictions, then there won't be contradictions. And so it doesn't matter how much evidence you cite. If somebody is convinced ahead of time, then it's kind of a lost cause. So what I try to do is sometimes just put a little chink in the armor. If you can just get them to admit that in fact Jesus could not have died on 2 different days, then if they can admit that much, once you get the chink in the armor, then you can make some progress.
It's like the scale that's missing from underneath Smaug's wing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Bam. Got it.
Shoot that arrow right in there.
Hobbit reference for the win. All right. Thank you very much. It's a big pleasure to talk to you, and I'm glad that you put up with me. I'll pass you on to Paul here.
And I made TJ to buy your new book, so he's going to read it. So he needs a little historical point of view when it comes to Jesus.
So what I wanted to ask you, Bart, is are there any readily available copies of the original Greek New Testament?
Manuscripts, yeah.
Manuscripts, I'm sorry, thank you. That we could use as a reference, like could people say, well, no, this gospel, this gospel, that, or well, that didn't exist. This was this is added later as a scribe, and et cetera, et cetera. So we can show what approximately the actual supposed gospel is supposed to be.
Yeah, so we have more manuscripts of the New Testament than we have for any other book from the ancient world. Way more than for Plato, for Euripides, for Cicero. Name your author. We have way more manuscripts for the New Testament. And so scholars are reasonably sure that in most places we have a pretty good idea of what the author said. We might be wrong. And there are a lot of places where we don't know. In some cases where we don't know, it doesn't really much matter. Sometimes the differences in the manuscripts are so immaterial that you can't even translate them into English. So, but there are other places that are pretty big and that are pretty important. So we don't have the manuscripts that the authors originally produced, but we do have so many later ones that most scholars think that in most places we have a pretty good idea.
And what's it around over 5,000 now? Correct, I think.
Yeah, it's around 5,500.
500. Yeah. Okay, good. Sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
Nice. Yeah. So, are there any big changes that there's no consensus on that people can actually argue? Oh, well, see, this actually. I mean, they'll latch on to anything. The people that will use little inconsistencies like this, they'll latch on to. Oh, well, this says this and this, so no, he must have been divine, or this is. Are there any actual big inconsistencies?
Yeah.
That there's no consensus on, or it's all really small ones?
No, they're big ones. I mean, so scholars are constantly, there's an annual professional meeting that I go to that's called the Society of Biblical Literature, and it's all the scholars and professors of biblical studies from around the country. So they're like 6,000 people who go to this conference. And at the conference, people read scholarly papers. And in one section of this Society of Biblical Literature, there's a section that deals with the differences in our manuscripts. And people read papers trying to argue, this passage is supposed to say this, no, it actually is supposed to say that. And there are disputes. And some of the differences are minor, but some of them are important. And it's the kind of thing where we're never going to know for sure because we're never going to have the originals.
Yeah, right. Unfortunately, we'll never have the originals. I wish we still had all the stuff that was in Library of Alexandria. That would be great, but
yeah,
that would be good.
You said that I've listened to some of your interviews at NPR and also some of your debates, and you said before about, of course, the Romans crucifying Jesus, how they would leave him out, and so why do people think that they would actually allow him to be taken down, I should say? Because wouldn't the Romans be like, no, you have to keep him up, and we'll kill you and throw you up there too if you try to touch him?
Yeah, that probably was their attitude, but it's not widely known that that was their attitude. And the reason people think that Jesus was given a burial is because in all of our Gospels, this figure, Joseph of Arimathea, who's a member of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, asks Pilate for the body and then gives Jesus a decent burial. And so it's found in Mark, and independently it's found in John, and it's found in the Gospel of Peter after the New Testament. And so people who support the idea that there was a burial typically point to that and say, look, I mean, it's independently attested. And, you know, until about 8 months ago, that's what I thought too. It was really just over the last 8 months that I realized that it seems really implausible that, given what we know about Roman crucifixion practices and what we know about Pontius Pilate in particular, I think it's really implausible that Pilate gave permission for Jesus to be an exception.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking. I mean, I don't see that a man like that and people known for brutality when they do the crucifixions would be, okay, yeah, go ahead and take him away, bury him.
Right. Yeah.
Especially not if he's supposed to be such a big figure rallying against them. I definitely don't see that. I'd see them be like, all right, he's going to rot until the bones fall off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was the typical procedure, because the death by crucifixion was seen as so horrible, not only because it was such a slow and agonizing death, but also because the bodies were left to decompose on the crosses and to be left for the scavengers to come. And so the ravages against the body after death were seen as horrible as the death itself, because people in the ancient world especially valued highly having a decent burial. And if you weren't given a decent burial, you were completely profaned, and it was but that was part of the punishment. You didn't give these people decent burials because they were the scum of the earth, and so you treated them that way.
Bart, I got 3 questions here. One's a little story, but we'll get on with it. This was from our forums. His name is Natural Numbers. Don't know what that means. He told me to ask you the questions in red, but I'm gonna basically go over everything here. He said, when I was a Christian, I looked to popular apologetic books like The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel and Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell for information about the historical basis for Christianity, which, you don't do that. Later, when I took a religious studies at a university, I found that these authors had been very misleading, and this was a major cause of my disillusionment with Christianity. What do you think the impact of apologist misrepresentation of real biblical scholarship has been on the public's understanding of the subject?
Yeah, well, these are both very widely read authors. Josh McDowell was a very important author back when I was a fundamentalist Christian. He wrote this book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He wrote a second book called More Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which is arguably the worst book ever written in the English language. It's completely ignorant. And Lee Strobel himself is not a scholar. I mean, neither one of these guys is a scholar. And so, they're non-scholars trying to take on scholars. And so it sounds convincing to a general populace who doesn't know any better, but there's not a scholar on the planet, a critical scholar on the planet, who takes either one of these seriously as being works of scholarship.
So basically,
Bart shoots from the hip.
He does, man. That's a hip shooter there, man. Oof. And he also follows up with, which I think is a great question, since you just said that, is, and more importantly, where could a layperson find reliable, accessible material on the history of Judaism and Christianity, looking for specific sources in particular, especially on the Old Testament, he says here?
Well, there are lots and lots of books. And so, I mean, one thing to do is just to contact professors in these fields. I mean, I teach a class on the Old Testament sometimes, and I use the introduction by John Collins, who teaches at Yale, or by Michael Coogan, who teaches at Harvard. They're both textbooks with bibliographies in them, and so they're very useful. I have a textbook on the New Testament that has bibliography after every chapter, and so you can pretty much trust biographies of reliable university level textbooks as long as they're not written for evangelical colleges.
Excellent, excellent. And of course, guys, I will put Bart's website in the description box of this video when it comes out, and also a link. Is Amazon okay, Bart, for people to purchase your books? And then I'll put a link to his page where you can purchase his previous books also, because Jesus Interrupted is great. I read that, and Forge is a good book too. Please, guys, go support Bart. He's great. He's a scholar. He knows his stuff. I'm like, you know, a New Testament scholar, so he's great. And you're only going to get a historical point of view for the most part from Bart, not a theological or theologian point of view, which I think is the better way to go. You want to know about the history. Second question here from our viewers is from a Layla Factor, and I think it's a good question. If Jesus of the Bible did in fact exist, wouldn't Philo of Alexandria known of him, or at least heard reports of this man stirring up trouble in Galilee? Now, I don't know if this is true or false or not. What do you think?
Philo of Alexandria. I think the answer is no. Philo would not have heard of him. You know, if Jesus were really walking on water and feeding 5,000 people with a couple loaves of bread and raising the dead and healing the sick and casting out demons, yeah, probably everybody would have heard of him. But the reality is the historical Jesus wasn't doing those things. He was a lower class peasant who had a small following in Galilee, and the only time even the leaders in Jerusalem, the first time they ever heard of him was when he showed up there and caused some trouble. So I don't think there's any way that an aristocratic Jew living in Alexandria, Egypt, would have heard of him. So I don't find it surprising at all.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. I thought that was a pretty good question. Another question here is from Ozzy, and I think Ozzy's here in the room. Ozzy is a teacher, I think. He's an academic, and we'll get on to his question. I think it's a good question, and both of the people he mentioned in this, I guess, statement and question have been on the show, Dr. Richard Carrier and also Dr. Robert M. Price, which is a friend of the show. Good people. I like them. Good people. Which you might disagree on the way they do things. But his question is this, or his statement is, your book, rebutting, I should say, mythicism, was met with a caustic review by Richard Carrier, and this was followed by a volley of responses back and forth between you and Dr. Carrier on your respective blogs. This ultimately resulted in you stating that you weren't interested in discussing mythicism any further with Dr. Carrier. I'm wondering if this is still your stance regarding a possible public discussion with Dr. Carrier, and if it is, would you consider debating or discussing the mythicist hypothesis publicly with Robert M. Price? What are the prospects for some sort of public discussion about mythicism between you and one of the proponents of mythicism?
Well, all things are possible.
True.
My reaction to Carrier is because of the way he comported himself. He's not a generous person. He's mean-spirited, and I don't want anything to do with him. And so if he were somebody who was actually interested in a disinterested exchange of ideas and thoughts, that would be fine. But in fact, what he tries to do is to bully and to mock. And I have no time for William Lane Craig because he tried to mock me publicly, and I have no time for Richard Carrier because he's tried to mock me publicly. I don't have that same attitude toward Robert Price. I think Robert Price is a good guy, and we disagree on things, which is absolutely fine. But we keep it at an academic level. We don't get personal in our interchanges with each other.
No, I totally agree with you. I think Carrier is, he doesn't believe that Jesus ever existed, like you said. Trust scholars. I understand that his research and stuff like that. He is very. There's other things that me and TJ disagree with him here about, which we're not going to get into. But Robert M. Price, he's a great guy, man. He's a friend of the show. I love the guy. He's a good guy. I've talked to him, a few times. I invited him to come to the Bill Nye debate with what's the other dude's name? Creation Museum dude. I don't really care. Ken Ham, yeah. So I invited him. We did over 2,000 people live viewing. It was a great turnout, and he had internet connections like I have tonight. Right. So he can be part of it, and he's such a great guy. Such a Bob. He said, just call me Bob. Okay, Bob. Robert M. Price? No, Bob. It's like, okay, good. We're good with that. So I got one last question. Oh, no questions here, right? We already went over what Ozzy said, right? So we're good with Ozzy. I will leave with one last question here. I think it's an important question. I don't think we've heard it from you tonight, Bart, is this. If I can find it here. And this is a popular question, I'm sure, is do you think Jesus actually existed? I know you believe he did, but please expand and include if you think Jesus was a divine being. We'll end with this question.
Right. Okay.
I think you pretty you touched it a little bit tonight, but let's ask the question direct.
Right. So I think Jesus definitely existed. I don't think there's really any serious doubt that there was a man, Jesus of Nazareth. I lay out a lot of the evidence in my book called "Did Jesus Exist?" Where I show why his existence is not called into question. Except by this very small and rather vocal group of mythicists. But among scholars of the ancient world, outside of the small mythicist group, I mean, Carrier and Price are the two scholars of the group. And other than those two, the many thousands of scholars in the world, nobody really doubts it. Was he a divine being? No, I don't think he's a divine being. I think he was a human being. The question is, if he was a human being, how did he become God? So that today there are 2 billion people in the world who call themselves Christian. Almost all of them think Jesus is God. And the question is, how did that happen? And so that's what I try and explore in this book, where I try and explain how it is that Jesus, who was an itinerant preacher in rural Galilee, how he became the Lord who created the universe. It's a really interesting story, and I think it's really important, not just for Christians, but for anyone who's interested in our form of civilization, since it ended up being a transforming moment for all of the West.
I totally agree. And it doesn't matter if you're a non-believer or if you're a Christian, a Muslim. It doesn't matter who you are. I think this is going to be a great. And I'm looking forward to reading it. I'll be honest with you. I did not read it. I did not get it yet, but I am going to order it on Amazon. I do highly recommend, from reading 2 of your previous books, for people to grab this, and also your previous back catalog. Guys, please go support Bart Ehrman and his new book here, How Jesus Became God, The Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. And Bart, thank you very much, man. It was an honor to have you on the show, and I've been looking forward. I was trying to get you for maybe a couple years now, and I'm happy that you came on tonight. And I think it was a great discussion. And I will have this video up in a couple days, and I will provide the links down below so people can support you and your works. So, sir, thank you very much, man. It was a great time.
Great, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Anytime, sir. Thumbs up, everybody in the chat for Bart.
Yeah, we all really appreciate it, man.
Okay, me too.
All right, Bart. Take care.
All right,
take care.
Thank you.
See you.
Ciao.